live on Sky News Australia. The Rita Panahi Show.
Good evening and welcome to the last Rita Panahi Show on a Friday night. I've got some exciting news on that front later in the hour. But first, coming up tonight, President Joe Biden is not fit to stand trial. Douglas Murray will weigh in on today's extraordinary developments. The daughter of slain grandmother Eileen White slams the Queensland Premier Stephen Miles. We'll look into what Barnaby Joyce was up to, lying on the side of the road mumbling into his phone. And later in the program, why the Irish basketball team has been accused of being anti-Semitic disgraces. And as always, plenty of lefties losing it, including this bloke.
What he is proposing to do is to make Canada great again. That is not what Canadians want.
But first, while we're talking lefties losing it, Queensland Premier Stephen Miles' response to a question about the state's youth crime crisis was bizarre, bordering on mildly deranged. It's no wonder that this clip has gone viral.
The absence of any reference to youth crime in your speech to the Queensland Media Club would have been noted by more than a few, including the people of those communities. Premier, I'm sure you concede.
If the Liberal opposition don't use that footage as a campaign ad for the October 26 election, then, well, they're not interested in winning. Queenslanders are understandably aghast watching the Labor Premier giggling like a giddy schoolgirl for a good 10 seconds as veteran Sky News journalist Adam Walters questioned him about the devastating impact of youth crime, including the murders of Brisbane mum Emma Lovell and last week's fatal stabbing of Ipswich grandmother Eileen White, allegedly by a teen out on bail. Now, the Sunshine State, like right here in Victoria, is in the midst of a youth crime crisis. And yet, the Premier confirmed on Tuesday that his government had no plans to make changes to the state's youth justice laws. Law-abiding folk are getting pretty fed up with a justice system that is sorely lacking justice. We have soft sentencing and too many violent thugs granted bail again and again, despite the danger they pose to the community. One thing you can say in favour of Queensland is that, unlike Victoria, there is no plan there to raise the age of criminal responsibility. The age of criminal liability is currently 10 in both states, but Victoria will be the first state to raise that to 12 this year and then 14 in 2027. I mean, what an utterly weak and misguided way to deal with a surge in youth crime. There's been a significant increase in the number of serious and violent offences committed by young offenders in Victoria, with a 26% jump from the previous year for 14 to 17-year-olds, according to state crime statistics released in September. But even more concerning was that 38% jump in serious offences committed by 10 to 13-year-olds compared to pre-pandemic data. Among the worrying trends was the massive jump in the number of 10 to 14-year-olds committing aggravated residential burglaries. That was up 44.6%, an increase from the previous year. But don't worry, in just a few short years, those crimes won't be crimes. They most likely won't be recorded as part of the state's crime stats, given the offenders will fall under the age of criminal responsibility. That's one way to fix soaring youth crime, by not classifying it as a crime. Genius move there. The changes to the criminal justice system are coming at a time when youth crime is dominating headlines, not just here, sometimes gaining international attention. Just late last month, footage of a vicious attack at Melbourne Southern Cross train station went viral, shocking millions around the world.
A woman with Down syndrome set upon by two teenagers. Their violent attack filmed by friends. After taunting her, they punched her repeatedly in the face, throwing her to the ground and kicking her in the head. An elderly man passing by stepped in as the woman lay helpless on the ground at Southern Cross Station.
That disturbing vision had millions of views, painting this city in a very awful light. We've got a problem with soft on crime laws and judges, and it's a symptom of a sick justice system corrupted by so-called progressive political dogma. It's an ideology preoccupied with the rights of offenders rather than the safety of the community. It's one where punishment and imprisonment are seen as the least desirable outcome instead of a means to deter crime and appropriately punish offenders. Contrast what's happening in Australia with the formerly lawless streets of El Salvador, where tough-on-crime president Nayib Bukele ordered gang members and violent offenders to be rounded up and sent to maximum security prisons. Guess what happened? The murder rate has plummeted in consecutive years. In 2023 alone, the homicide rate fell 70%. The measures implemented by the President of El Salvador have been widely derided by the leftist Western media, but they are hugely popular at home. Turns out when you lock up violent criminals, they can no longer commit further offences. It's no surprise that Bukele was just re-elected with more than 80% of the vote. Now we're going to go to Prue McSween shortly for the latest news of the day. Before we discuss the youth crime crisis, let's just have a look at this startling footage of former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. Here he is lying on the side of the road in Canberra at 11:30 at night last night. He was apparently mumbling into his phone. He was rolling around. He's released a statement to the Daily Mail, who put up that footage. Barnaby said he was embarrassed by the footage and he explained, "I was walking back to my accommodation after Parliament rose at 10 p.m. While on the phone, I sat on the edge of a plant box, fell over, kept talking on the phone, and very animatedly was referring to myself for having fallen over." Prue, what do you make of that footage and explanation? He is a character.
Look, he is. He's a larrikin. He's tough. He probably was giving it to himself. I basically can't believe that, somebody is decided that they're going to pull their phone out rather than try and render assistance. You don't know if he'd hurt himself really badly. I mean, this is just typical now of opportunists, whether they were members of, a rival party, I don't know, who just thought this would be fun to get Barnaby in a really embarrassing situation. I just find he's a target. People always want to have a go at Barnaby. I also have a worry about that Canberra bubble, that whole thing of, working till 10 o'clock at night. It's not a healthy thing for our politicians to be doing and making decisions on our behalf. So I feel sorry for him. I hope he hasn't hurt himself. And maybe next time, I don't know, stick to lemonade.
Now to more serious matters, and 4 teenagers have been found guilty of the brutal murder of a 16-year-old boy in Melbourne. Declan Cutler was killed in a suburb of Reservoir. The teens, all gang members, beat the boy, kicked and stomped on his head and stabbed him more than 50 times. And one even released a rap song about it. Prue, he was not even the intended target of this attack. He was just separated from his friends and brutally murdered. It was 8 against 1. I just read that story and feel utterly sick.
How many people, innocent people, are to be killed before the laws are changed? We have a gang problem, a youth crime problem. I saw the statistics. When 10-year-old kids are committing these kinds of crimes, I have to say we should follow what America's doing. Where are the bloody parents? And the parents should be made responsible. We saw that in America recently, and I think we need to seriously consider something like that, because I don't believe any child is born a little mongrel. or a violent thug. It's the family environment that is turning them into this. They're people who shouldn't have had children. They're not interested in parenting, imposing discipline, and wondering where their kids are in the middle of the night. So the laws have to change. Our politicians have to get tough. Magistrates and judges are just administering the law as it's dictated, and these kids know they're getting away with it.
Now, Cindy McAuliffe, the daughter of Wileen White, the grandmother who was fatally stabbed at an Ipswich shopping centre on the weekend, has slammed the Queensland Premier as not the man for the job after he laughed off a question about youth crime in Queensland and suggested her grandmother's murder could not have been prevented. Let's have a listen.
You know what? I was really glad he said it, because I'm like, you're not the man for the job. If you can't reassure people in the community that this is at the utmost priority.
That is the victim's daughter, not granddaughter. Prue, is Stephen Miles inept? Is he out of touch? Or was that bizarre performance we saw from him a sign of just nerves? I'm really at a loss to understand what happened, because for him to giggle and carry on for more than 10 seconds, it wasn't just a momentary reaction. I find it utterly bizarre. You do not see seasoned politicians behaving like that.
Well, the man's inept. And I think he was giggling because you know that people giggle when they're nervous, when they know they're not up to it. The man is not up to the job, clearly, has no EQ, and he's just a fool. I mean, he's a laughing stock. He's a puppet of the unions. He was put in there so he can be manipulated, and you can see why, because he probably hasn't got a thought in his head that maybe the unions hadn't told him what he should say if he's been asked that question. I find it astounding that that daughter of that victim is so composed. I would be so angry. I would be livid and I would be taking him on. How disgusting. But what he is doing is showing how the Labor Party has failed this community in so many ways, and thank goodness we can all see, and hopefully the Queenslanders are waking up to this inept party and this fool of a man who's making all the decisions in the chair at the moment.
Well, the state elections in October, we'll see if they'll remember that performance. Now, let's speak about the royals. The King and his prodigal son, Prince Harry, spoke about his bombshell memoir Spared during their 45-minute meeting after the King announced his cancer diagnosis. Harry's already back in the US, Prue. I think it's fairly telling that he stayed in a hotel. He was not allowed to stay, or he did not want to stay at the palace. He had no meeting with his brother or the Queen. That says a lot, doesn't it? The relations are certainly strained. Can this cancer diagnosis bring father and son back together?
Well, I think Charles is a softie. He obviously loves his son and his son loves him, his father, I'm sure. But and it's interesting how, illnesses like cancer can bring people together. I don't know that William, they may find that they can move on. We hear, and who knows, that they discuss the book. The point is that I can't see that after the damage he's done to William and Kate, that they will ever forgive him and accept him. And I don't know that
and Queen Camilla.
Yeah, and Camilla,
the vicious things he said about Camilla, I think that is not going to be easily forgiven or forgotten. Prue McSween, always a pleasure. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks, Rita.
The ABC was forced to cancel their Drag Queen Story Hour for children aged 3 to 5 after what they called a hateful and offensive response. South Australian Senator Alex Antic was one of those asking whether an event like this was sympathetic to the views of mainstream Australia. And he joins me now. Senator, are you responsible for this hateful and offensive response the ABC is complaining about?
Well, I mean, you have to ask them, Rita. I mean, I was asked to comment on it, and I stand by those comments. I think it's, not uncommon for the ABC to be focusing on these sorts of events. It strikes me they talk a big game on diversity and inclusion, but that doesn't seem to extend to political thought or the things that are of interest to mainstream Australia. I mean, when was the last time you saw a fishing show or a motor racing show or anything like that? But they're quite happy to cover these events. So, look, I don't know, but I don't think that you'd get too many Aussies that would think covering drag queen story time in front of 3-year-olds was a reasonable thing to do.
Motor racing, fishing, Senator, check your toxic masculinity. The ABC would be horrified by those suggestions. But the ABC's desire to push this sort of a radical gender theory and have drag queens perform for little children, I've got to say, is a little concerning. Why is there such an obsession by so many on the left these days to push this agenda on very young children?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and I think I can safely say I don't really have any particular problem with drag shows. I've never been to one. I've never participated in one. It'll strike you as extraordinary to learn. But the problem here is the exposure to these events in front of children. I just don't think anyone, I think you could take 9.5 out of 10 Australians would agree with that statement, that these are adult content in many instances. And the obsession of the left to try and push these, look, who knows the answer to that, other than to say, I don't think there'd be too many Australians that have any difficulty with the ABC trying to stick to its lane and reporting on. Why don't we be generous? Why don't they stick to their lane and report on, on climate change exclusively from now on and leave it at that?
Don't give them ideas. Now, you made a speech in Parliament this week highlighting how the activist class, together with Labor and the Greens, are fanning the flames of historical grievances. What is that doing to race relations in this country?
Well, I mean, I think you have to only really look at the recent events. I don't think we've been more divided on this topic than prior to The Voice. I think it dredged up a lot of ill feeling and ill will, and Aussies ultimately quite rightly rejected that division. But we see this all the time. I mean, I was struck this week on our first week back at Parliament, walking into the building. I mean, really, if Aussies want to understand how out of step with mainstream Australia this building has become, and how in tune with inner city Australia, it feels like walking into the offices of Ultima, I've got to say, Parliament House, under this government. You will see it there. The building, however, and all of the bureaucrats and the lobbyists and the media class that inhabit that building are obsessed with this topic. And I don't think it's doing us any favour. It certainly doesn't seem to be addressing the real issues in remote communities. So whatever it is doing, we appear to be going backwards on this subject, and yet we never seem to have had people screaming about racial division and radical, racial theory and all sorts of things. But it seems to be pushing the dial in the wrong direction, and The Voice shows that Aussies want to be unified and not divided.
Senator, you also mentioned in your speech that it doesn't seem to be really about reconciliation anymore. It seems to be more about retribution. Do you really see that as the mindset of the activist class?
Yeah, look, I really do, Rita. I think that, if you look at the concept of reconciliation, we're talking about an act that was wrong and then some form of forgiveness. And it doesn't strike me that there is any evidence that the activist class really want to see that historical grievance industry come to an end. I mean, after all, it's good for business. Ultimately, though, I want to know when we've reconciled. Ultimately, I mean, it becomes a question of how many times and how many different initiatives have to be involved in order to get to this point. And I don't think we're going to see that out of the activist class. We see that on a range of issues. There are never going to be enough emissions reduction targets, by the way. This is what the left do. They're always slicing away at the salami. And this concept of reconciliation, however noble it may be in some people's minds, where is the end point on this? And, when do we know when we've reconciled, Rita?
Now, I do think it's time to rethink this entire agenda. All the empty virtue signalling, the welcome to country, the acknowledgement of country, all those things that are designed to appease the activist class, I think the overwhelming majority of Australians would rather do away with. Before you go, I want to show you some footage from Spain where farmers are protesting the environmental policies of the European Union. Have a look at this footage of police blocking the roads to stop the farmers. But guess what? They're in tractors, Senator, so they just go through the field and around the police roadblock. But on a serious note, there is this growing global movement against these daft environmental policies, particularly in Europe. Is there going to be a loosening of green farming requirements? Do our farmers have something to fear about what we're seeing in places like the Netherlands and Spain?
Seems like the Spanish police are now made up entirely out of Manuel from 40 Towers. It's staggering that happened. It's like the Maginot Line. They just went around the other side of it. But good on them for doing it. I mean, if you want to see passion, you will see it out of European farmers, French, German and Spanish now. And they're all protesting the same thing, which is the use of this so-called climate apocalypse to shut down farming in the name of the climate. I think this is a growing trend. I am very gladdened, though, to see that there is some pushback from the farmers in Europe. And I say it to farmers here in Australia all the time, don't think that the powers that be in Australia aren't coming for your farming as well. This is all about climate change being used as a way of, shutting down this sort of industry. And, of course, we know, the sensible Australians know that there's no farmers, there's no food. So I want to see, I want to see this come to an end. This kind of climate nonsense has got to stop. I mean, we cannot have farmers being put through this here in Australia.
Senator Alex Antic, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks, Rita.
More news on green madness. Mr Bean actor Rowan Atkinson is being blamed by the UK's House of Lords for a drop in sales of electric vehicles. The Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee says an opinion piece Atkinson wrote for The Guardian last year was one of the most damaging articles in the UK's quest to achieve net zero. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak pledged to ban all new petrol and diesel cars by 2035. But Rowan Atkinson, who says he bought his first EV 18 years ago, well, he wrote, "Increasingly, I'm feeling that our honeymoon with electric cars is coming to an end. Friends with an environmental conscience often ask me as a car person whether they should buy an electric car. I tend to say that if their car is an old diesel and that they do a lot of city centre motoring, they should consider a change. But otherwise, hold fire for now. Electric propulsion will be of real global environmental benefit one day, but that day has yet to dawn." That's an understatement indeed. The Australian's environment editor, Graham Lloyd, joins me now. Graham, there are a lot of early adopters who are having second thoughts about their EV purchases, aren't they?
Yes, good evening, Rita. The truth is that the Rowan Atkinson piece has caused such a fuss because the numbers are coming in and the sales of EVs are about half what governments and the car industry had hoped they would be. And worse than that, people who have bought an EV often, when they buy their next vehicle, they're going back to internal combustion engines. So there's a real disconnect between what is supposed to be happening and what is happening in actual fact. And Rowan Atkinson's a very interesting person. Not only is he a very funny actor as Mr Bean, he's also an electrical engineer and has a master's in that subject. He's a car nut, and as you said, he's a very early adopter of these cars, and he's looked at them on a life cycle analysis and said, well, you can't just measure what comes out of the tailpipe. You have to look at the cost of building them, how long they last, and all these other things. And on those measures, the best environmental thing people could do is hang on to their existing car longer and not drive it as much.
Absolutely. Now, you wrote a piece about the federal court case involving Santos's $4.5 billion pipeline and how it's exposed how sacred stories of Aboriginal mythology are now on the same level as scientific fact when it comes to green experts. What does this mean for the country? How much is that going to cost us?
Well, this is something that the courts now have to grapple with. There's been an adoption, if you like, of Indigenous mythology adopted by the Green movement to try and stop projects. I think the federal court did everyone a favour by actually putting this to the test, and they found, well, really the expert who gave evidence had been motivated by his own desires to stop the project, and he had sort of laid that onto the Indigenous community. And it really begs the question, how much of this is going on in this area? And I explored a number of areas, particularly around planning approvals for renewable energy developments where there might be some competing environmental issues. And the fact is that a lot of these evidence put forward by experts is not tested under the rigours that it would be if it were presented in court. And there's a really good argument that there should be a much greater onus put onto this expert evidence that's leading to projects that, you know, either inconvenience people or are going to make a lot of money for the state, and they should be allowed to proceed.
Graham Lloyd, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Don't go anywhere. The brilliant Douglas Murray is up next, and he's going to tell us all about Joe Biden and what has been a astonishing day for the US president, and lefties losing it. That's next. Welcome back. Now it's time for Lefties Losing It. Now let's start the segment with the king of performative caring, the Canadian himbo himself, Justin Trudeau.
What he is proposing to do is to make Canada great again. That is not what Canadians want. He is pining for a nostalgia that, quite frankly, Canadians do not feel.
Yes, why would Canadians want Canada to be great again? What a shocking concept that would be. Let's go to the leftist utopia of California, to an Apple store near Oakland, where this learned gentleman is helping himself to some new phones. Just how many phones can he fit into his pants? The best part of that clip is when he walks out the store right past a cop car. No fear, there he is, because it's California. And yet some supposedly sensible lefties still vote for Democrats like California Governor Gavin Newsom. Some even want him to be president.
How do you feel about Newsom?
Had him on my show Friday.
I saw that.
And first of all, I love him. Just one reason I want him to run for president, well, is because he's obviously a winner.
Define a winner.
Well, he would win the election.
Oh.
Right.
What areas has Newsom won in? You said he's a winner.
Winner of the election. He could win the election.
But based on what, though? Do you want results? Like, what has he done to California to say he's a winner?
Oh, God. I don't know. It's too...
Bill, you're a smart guy.
You know what? He made it rain, okay, dude?
That was Bill Maher losing it and being embarrassed just a little bit by Patrick Bet-David on his own show. Now, we've got him. I know he's your favourite. Every week we speak to one of the finest thinkers of his generation, the best-selling author of inspired works, including The Strange Death of Europe, The War on the West and the Madness of Crowds. Douglas, let's start with what could be the end of Joe Biden's run for re-election. A special counsel report found he willfully retained and disclosed classified documents at his home, but no charges were recommended because the 81-year-old commander-in-chief is greatly diminished mentally. The report not only noted Biden's diminished faculties and lack of mental state of willfulness, but it also noted Joe Biden couldn't even remember when he was vice president. So he's too diminished to stand trial, but he can run the most powerful country in the world?
I know. It was an astonishing revelation, this, Rita. It came out late yesterday, and many people said immediately, well, that's it. Clearly, the Democrats are trying to finally push Joe Biden off the nomination ticket because this revelation, as it were, from within. I mean, it's not coming from the Republicans. This revelation that during his questioning, he couldn't remember which years he'd been vice president. He couldn't remember, I think, the year he'd run for president. And it was clear they didn't want to go ahead because a jury would find that he had not enough cognitive ability to talk about his own experience. And the idea that this same man is in the most powerful position in the world is something which is it's a scandal you and I have talked about before. The Democrats have clearly been trying to cover it over. They've been hoping he'll get better or something like that, or it'll become less noticeable, and they can just allow him to roll on. And the fact is, though, again, we saw this only in the press conference he gave to say in response to these revelations, no, I'm okay. During the press conference, he said he just had a conversation with President Sisi of Mexico. As you know, President Sisi is not the president of Mexico. He's president of Egypt. No. But there was a time when you just said that was a normal Biden gaffe. But now it looks like it's not just a normal Biden gaffe. It's really rather sad.
And if he wasn't protected by the bulk of the media all this time, today wouldn't be so shocking. But if you've paid attention, and we've discussed it, for more than 3 years now, even whilst he was running for president, the cognitive decline there has been obvious. And yeah, for reasons that defy logic, his handlers had him address the nation today. It did not go well. He lashed out at the special counsel and at the reporters who questioned him about his cognitive abilities.
For months when you were asked about your age, you would respond with the words, watch me. Many American people have been watching, and they have expressed concerns about your age.
That is your judgment. That is your judgment. That is not the judgment of the press.
That's not the judgment of the press. She is the press. And as you mentioned, he also seemed to think Mexico shares a border with Gaza. He mixed up the Egyptian leader with that of Mexico.
As you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate.
Douglas, what happens next? Can he run again?
Well, I'd have thought it's just increasingly clear that he can't. But as we know, there is this kind of extraordinary situation that Biden has, which is that the Democrats believe that if there's any major shakeup on their ticket this year, it'll all just be an advantage to Donald Trump, who's certainly the most likely person by a very far margin to become the Republican nominee. And effectively, Trump and Biden have been sort of like this. They've been leaning on each other. And both parties think if their guy goes, then they collapse. Now, the Republicans may or may not be right in that. The Democrats, I think, to an extent, are right in that, because, you know, the question for them is they don't have a very good bench of people in their party. They may have coming up. There's some talented younger congressmen and so on, congresswomen in the Democratic Party. There's also some absolute left-wing nutters. But the main thing is that it's not obvious who would replace Biden as the nominee, particularly at this relatively late stage. Obviously, it can't be Kamala Harris, who we know, in the polls that the American public regard as absolutely unfit for the presidency. But they have to sort of find some way to deal with the Kamala problem. And then you got, somebody like Gavin Newsom of California. And we've just seen your previous segment, Rita. what did he do to California? He did that. He did that. He made it a state in which theft was legal.
He's been a disaster in every role that he's served, but he keeps failing up, and gosh, he could be president one day. Now, let's move along to your home country. You wrote a powerful piece for The Spectator today where you said you're embarrassed by modern Britain and that you no longer even recognise your own country. Why is that?
Well, there's several things. One is the fact that, as I say in that piece, virtues and certain aspects of the national characteristic, which I grew up with, and which I think epitomized Britain, like a sort of certain doggedness, a sort of stoicism, and actually I think a courage in the face of adversity, a quiet courage, which was strong when provoked, all seem to have disappeared. There's endless sort of whining. The House of Commons this week spent its time talking about whether or not the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, should have made a reference to trans people that wasn't 100% politically correct in the eyes of the left, whilst the mother of a murdered trans child was in the gallery of the Commons, and they all were just out competing each other to be more and more invasive about that. Meantime, massive problems affecting the country, like the fact we have these hate marches every Saturday, in which people are completely, mainly Muslims, are completely unbothered about exposing their bigotries, their hatreds, including their hatred of Britain. This just goes on all the time. Every Saturday, it happened again last Saturday, they actually clamber over our war memorials to our war dead, and they defile them and desecrate them. And the police let them do it. And by contrast, there has recently been an MP who we discussed before who stepped down because of threats to his life from Muslim extremists. And everyone in the Commons and elsewhere sort of said, oh, well, how sad. And I don't recognize that. I remember the generation of Margaret Thatcher, who, when the Brighton bomb went off, the conference bomb, the Brighton hotel bomb that was meant to kill her, did kill a number of her friends and many others, stood outside the next day and said, the conference will go ahead. We will never give in to the men of violence. I don't know where that spirit has gone. It seems to have been beaten out of many of the British people, at least, certainly our ruling class.
Well, yeah, that stoic, stiff upper lip has been replaced by self-loathing, it seems. Is that what Britain needs? A leader like Thatcher? The options of the coming election are pretty grim, Douglas. Ain't no Thatchers there.
No, there certainly ain't. I mean, Keir Starmer is just trying to get through and get into office with people noticing as little as possible about his policies. I suspect he'll make them plain to us, as I said before, once he's in office. And Rishi Sunak just has this terrible, terrible, increasing desperation in his eyes as he realizes that he's for the chop at the electoral ballot box. But yes, it's this thing. I mean, you can see him there, this sort of grinning, desperate to please, no real leadership, no willingness to do the unpopular things you sometimes need to do and just explaining, not leading but following, as the phrase goes. But as I say, the thing that just stuns me is, Britain has undergone massive demographic transformation in the last couple of decades, and it's a transformation which has gone on rocket fuel under this Conservative government. It will almost certainly continue at a similar rate under a Labour government. And it seems to me that it's because of this that our political class is so incapable of identifying problems in front of it. When the MP who said he would stand down because of threats to his life stood down, he said that one of the reasons was that his murdered colleague, Sir David Amess, was murdered by Ali Harbi Ali. And one of the other people he wanted to apparently kill was Mike Freer. Well, in an interview this week, Mike Freer was asked about this, and the interviewer said, what motivated Ali Harbi Ali? And Mike Freer said, I'm not sure about that. I don't know. Well, here's what. He was killed by an Islamist who followed jihadist ideology. And it's a darn fool position for a man to be in, to stand up for somebody more than he's willing to stand up for himself. But I can say this on behalf of Mike Freer. The person who was apparently thinking of killing him and who did kill Sir David Amess MP was motivated by jihadist ideology. And I would have liked to have seen in the wake of that, Sir David's MPs not just mourn his death as if he had died of natural causes, but to have said, we will root this ideology out of Britain wholesale. It has no place here. Did anyone come near saying that? No, not a bit.
Oh,
and that is a catastrophe for Britain.
Absolute catastrophe. They didn't even say it when jihadists murdered children at a concert. You just wonder what they're thinking and why they just show this cowardice. You've been impacted by this in a small way just in the past week. Your speech had to be moved after the venue submitted to the bullying and the threats, I'd imagine, of the anti-Israeli mob, but the protesters still turned up at another venue to scream abuse about you. Let's have a look.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Lyric theatre, shame on you! No much theatre, shame on you!
Douglas, do you feel safe in modern Britain, in London?
Well, I don't think anyone's particularly safe in modern Britain, modern London. I think Jews are particularly unsafe. I was meant to be speaking at the Apollo Theatre on Shaftesbury Avenue in the heart of the West End. 1,000 people were turning out. And the theatre was bullied into cancelling the event on the day. And the event was moved to a synagogue, which was the only place the police could protect. I believe that the job of the British police on such an occasion, I believe the job of the theatre is to keep the show on the road. And I believe the job of the police is to ensure that the public and attendees are safe. But that wasn't what happened. Some of the staff were apparently threatened, ushers and so on. And instead of the owners reporting this to the police immediately and the police taking action, the staff said they wouldn't turn up to work. So then more people were brought in from another theatre, and then they had their addresses leaked. They were apparently threatened and intimidated in turn, and they too refused to turn up. So,
Douglas, it's mob rule. It's mob rule that the thugs are winning. It is not should not be happening in a civilised country. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. Don't go anywhere. Still to come, the Irish women's basketball team disgraced themselves with their anti-Semitic behaviour, and I'll hear more from Rabbi Shmuley Botaic on Melburnians, Jews in Melbourne leaving suburbs where they no longer feel safe. Welcome back. Earlier today, Ireland's female basketball team disgraced itself by refusing to shake the hands of their Israeli opponents, and they also refused to line up at centre court for the national anthems. This was before a Eurobasket 2025 qualifier, which Israel won easily, 87-57. Now, before the game, Israeli player Dor Sar had said the Irish team is quite anti-Semitic, and gosh, they did seem determined to prove her right. Joining me now is author Rabbi Shmuley Botaic. Rabbi, what do you make of the team's antics? So far, Basketball Ireland is standing behind their players.
They lost. They lost huge to Israel, and isn't that what matters? Isn't that what sports is about? You know, Rita, Ireland was dominated by England for 800 years. They know what cruelty, they know what persecution is all about. They fought for their rights. The fact that they have no sympathy for the Jewish people who were left homeless for 2,000 years as they were exiled, persecuted, gassed to death, just shows that they've lost their way. But what's particularly interesting to me is that this is a women's team that they boycotted. You know, the October 7th massacre was mostly against innocent women, gang rape, decapitation of women, women being shot in their genitals, having their breasts cut off, all of which was documented by the New York Times at great length with interviews of hundreds of people. So the fact that the Irish team would take this out on a women's basketball team is particularly telling. This is misogyny, this is anti-Semitism, and it's a disgrace, like you said, to Ireland and a disgrace to their history.
Now, we've seen this happen in cities like Brussels and Paris, but I've got to say, I never thought it would happen in Melbourne. Today's Herald Sun reports Jewish residents of the northern suburbs of Fitzroy, Coburg and Thornbury are moving south due to fears of anti-Semitic attacks. These suburbs have recently become incredibly left-wing, and Jewish-owned businesses have reported doxing and boycotting attempts from members of the public. Now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was asked about this today, and he said he's never seen such social disharmony in Australia.
I have not seen a rise in social disharmony like I've seen in recent times. It is tragic that people feel that they have to consider moving from their local communities. It's completely unacceptable. It's not the Australia I want to see.
Rabbi, your wife is Australian. You spend a lot of time in this country. Do you recognise it anymore?
Listen to what Anthony Albanese just said, Rita. Notice he said people, he won't say Jews. Notice he says disharmony, he won't say anti-Semitism. This kind of nebulous nonsense is why the problem never gets better, because we are afraid to point the finger and say, this is a 2,000-year-old hatred, which Australia was largely impervious to. And now it is slowly migrating down under. And not only is it undermining Australian society, it's actually undermining Australia's global image. Because the reason why people love Australia and tourism can flourish all the way a 25-hour flight from the United States is because Australians are perceived to be very easygoing. There's very little attention. They're really, shrimp on the Barbie, sorry to be so American. Australians were always seen as a very benign and warm and welcoming people until leaders like Anthony Albanese get past their ridiculous wokeism and their silly nebulous statements that are meaningless. People have to get along. Cut the kumbaya nonsense. This is anti-Semitism. Jews are having to move out of their neighborhoods. Australia is becoming seen around the world as an anti-Semitic country, and it breaks my heart because, as you said, I'm married to an Aussie, lived in Australia, and I love Australia.
Absolutely. Now, before you go, singer Annie Lennox used her performance of Sinead O'Connor's Nothing Compares to You at the Grammys to call for a ceasefire. Let's have a quick look.
Artists for ceasefire, peace in the world.
Now, what is your response to Annie Lennox? And I'm sure many well-meaning folk who say they want a ceasefire, not because they want to help Hamas, but because they want to stop innocent people from being harmed and killed.
Well, we are 1 month away from the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. Why didn't anyone call for a ceasefire and just allow the Hutus to kill 800,000 Tutsis and then say, okay, let's all just call it quits and, love each other and roast marshmallows together? Ceasefire means that you leave genocidal Hamas in power so that Jews will die and be murdered and beheaded and be burned to death. That's what it means. Ceasefire is another word for surrender. Israel surrenders. Now, let me be clear. I also believe in ceasefire. I'm going to officially right now in this beautiful kosher restaurant, I want Hamas to surrender unconditionally. There will be a ceasefire.
Rabbi Shmuley Bertayek, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Rita. God bless you.
Still to come, that exciting news I mentioned at the top of the show. I can't wait to share it with you. Now, before I go, I mentioned at the top of the show that this will be the last Rita Panahi show on a Friday night because we are going from a weekly program to 4 nights a week starting on Monday. I'll be with you Monday to Thursday at 11 p.m, replacing Piers Morgan Uncensored. We are going to have so much fun. That's it from me tonight. I'll see you Sunday morning for Outsiders. Up next is James Morrow with the US Report.